Welcome back to the English Podcast Daily with Peter. I am your host, and today we're tackling something that confuses almost every English learner: grammar. You've probably spent hundreds of hours studying grammar rules. You've memorized verb tenses, learned about gerunds and infinitives, studied subjunctive mood. You've done grammar exercises until your brain hurt. But here is the thing. You are probably wasting your time on grammar that doesn't matter. I know that sounds crazy, but the truth is, there are some grammar rules that are absolutely essential for communication, and there are other grammar rules that are basically irrelevant, and most learners don't know the difference. So they spend time on the irrelevant stuff and neglect the important stuff. It's like studying for a test by memorizing the footnotes while ignoring the main content. Well, today we're going to figure out which grammar rules actually matter and which ones you can basically ignore. To help me break this down, I am joined by Dr. James Wilson, a linguist and grammar expert who's taught English for over 20 years. James, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Peter. I am really excited to talk about this because grammar is one of the most misunderstood aspects of language learning. Most learners have a very distorted view of how important grammar is, and it's actually holding them back.
That's really interesting. So let's start there. How important is grammar for English communication?
Great question. So here is the truth. Grammar is important, but not as important as most learners think. Let me give you some perspective. Research on language acquisition shows that comprehensible input, hearing or reading English in context, is the most important factor for language learning. Grammar study is actually one of the least important factors. This might shock you, but studies show that learners who focus heavily on grammar rules don't actually learn faster than learners who focus on comprehensible input and communication. In fact, sometimes they learn slower because they're spending time on grammar instead of on real communication.
So, grammar study isn't the most efficient use of time?
Exactly. Don't get me wrong. Grammar is useful, but it's not the foundation of language learning. The foundation is comprehensible input and communication. Think about how native speakers learn their language. Children don't study grammar rules. They just hear the language and learn it naturally. They learn grammar implicitly through exposure, not explicitly through study. And interestingly, native speakers often don't know the grammar rules for their own language. If you ask a native English speaker why they say, "I am going" instead of "I go," they might not be able to explain the rule, but they know it's correct because they've heard it thousands of times.
So grammar rules are learned implicitly through exposure, not explicitly through study.
Yes, and this is important for learners to understand. You don't need to study every grammar rule to become fluent. You need exposure to the language. Grammar study can help, but it's not the foundation.
So what is the role of grammar study?
Grammar study can be useful for: first, understanding patterns. When you study grammar, you learn to recognize patterns. This can help you understand the language better. For example, if you know that English uses the present perfect for recent actions, you can understand why native speakers say, "I have eaten" instead of "I ate" in certain contexts. Second, producing language more accurately. When you are producing language, speaking or writing, grammar knowledge can help you be more accurate, but this is secondary to fluency. It's better to speak fluently with some grammar mistakes than to speak slowly and carefully trying to be perfect. Third, correcting mistakes. If you know a grammar rule, you can recognize when you are breaking it and correct yourself. This is useful for self-correction, but the key point is, grammar study should support your language learning, not be the foundation of it.
So grammar is a tool, not the foundation.
Exactly. And most learners have it backwards. They think grammar is the foundation, so they spend most of their time on grammar, but they should be spending most of their time on comprehensible input and communication, with grammar study as a supporting tool.
James, let's talk about some common grammar myths. What are some things learners believe about grammar that aren't actually true?
Oh, there are so many. Let me go through some of the biggest ones. Myth number 1, you need to know all grammar rules to be fluent. This is completely false. Native speakers don't know all grammar rules, and you don't need to either. You can be fluent knowing only the most common grammar structures. In fact, 80% of communication uses about 20% of grammar structures. So you can focus on the high-frequency structures and ignore the rare ones.
So the 80/20ths rule applies to grammar?
Absolutely. And this is liberating because it means you don't have to study everything. You can focus on what matters.
What's the second myth?
Myth number 2, grammar mistakes make you sound uneducated or stupid. This is also false. Native speakers make grammar mistakes all the time. They use double negatives. They end sentences with prepositions. They use incomplete sentences, and nobody thinks they're uneducated. What matters is whether people understand you. If you make a grammar mistake but people understand your meaning, the mistake doesn't matter. Communication is more important than correctness.
So grammar mistakes aren't as big a deal as learners think.
Exactly. And this is why I always tell learners, focus on communication first, grammar second. If you are trying to be perfect, you'll hesitate and speak slowly. But if you focus on communication, you'll speak fluently, and people will understand you.
What's the third myth?
Myth number 3. You need to study grammar before you can speak. This is false. You can start speaking from day one, even with very basic grammar knowledge. In fact, speaking is the best way to learn grammar. When you speak, you get feedback, and you learn from that feedback. Many learners spend months or years studying grammar before they try to speak, but this is backwards. You should start speaking early and learn grammar through speaking.
So you don't need to master grammar before you start speaking.
In fact, trying to master grammar before speaking is a recipe for failure. You'll get bored, lose motivation, and never actually speak. It's much better to start speaking early and learn grammar through communication.
What's the fourth myth?
Myth number 4. All grammar mistakes are equally bad. This is false. Some grammar mistakes are much worse than others. For example, if you say, I go to the store yesterday, you are using the wrong tense, but people will still understand you. This is a minor mistake. But if you say, I go store, you are missing a preposition. This is a more serious mistake because it affects comprehensibility. And if you say, I store go, you are using wrong word order. This is a very serious mistake because it's hard to understand. So learners should focus on the grammar mistakes that affect comprehensibility, not the minor mistakes that don't affect understanding.
So some grammar mistakes matter more than others.
Yes, and learners often focus on the wrong mistakes. They obsess over small details like whether to use a or the, when they should be focusing on bigger issues like word order or verb forms.
What's the fifth myth?
Myth number 5. Native speakers follow all grammar rules. This is completely false. Native speakers break grammar rules all the time. They use sentence fragments, they use double negatives, they use ain't, they use gonna and wanna. They end sentences with prepositions. These are all incorrect according to traditional grammar rules. But native speakers use them because they're natural and efficient. So if native speakers break grammar rules, why should learners obsess over following them perfectly? The point is to communicate, not to follow arbitrary rules.
So even native speakers don't follow all grammar rules.
Exactly. And this is liberating for learners. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to communicate.
Are there other myths?
One more. Myth number 6. Grammar is more important than vocabulary. This is backwards. Vocabulary is much more important than grammar. If you know 1,000 words but poor grammar, you can still communicate. But if you know perfect grammar but only 100 words, you can't communicate much. Native speakers can understand you even with grammar mistakes, as long as you know the words. But if you don't know the words, they can't understand you no matter how perfect your grammar is. So learners should prioritize vocabulary over grammar.
So vocabulary is actually more important than grammar.
Yes, and this is why I always recommend that learners focus on vocabulary first, then grammar. Build your vocabulary foundation, and grammar will come naturally through exposure.
James, so if not all grammar rules matter, which ones do?
Great question. So, there are certain grammar structures that are absolutely essential for communication. These are the ones learners should focus on. First, Basic verb tenses. Present simple, past simple, and present perfect are essential. These are used constantly in communication. If you can use these three tenses, you can communicate about most situations. Other tenses like past perfect, future perfect, and conditional perfect are less common. You can learn them later, but they're not essential for basic communication.
So focus on the three basic tenses first.
Yes, and the good news is, these are relatively easy to learn. Once you know these, you can handle most conversations. Second, basic sentence structure. Subject, verb, object, word order is essential. This is the basic structure of English sentences. If you know this, you can construct sentences that people understand. Other structures like inversion or fronting are less common and can be learned later. Third, basic pronouns and articles. Pronouns like I, you, he, she, it, we, they are essential. Articles like a and the are important, though learners often struggle with them. Fourth, basic prepositions. Prepositions like in, on, at, to, from are essential. These are used constantly. If you know the most common prepositions, you can handle most situations. Fifth, basic question formation. You need to know how to form questions. This is essential for communication. Sixth, basic negation. You need to know how to form negative sentences. This is essential. If you know these 6 categories, you have the foundation for basic communication. Everything else is less essential.
So there are really only 6 essential grammar categories.
Yes, and within each category, there are high-frequency structures and low-frequency structures. Focus on the high-frequency ones first. For example, within verb tenses, present simple is much more common than past perfect. So learn present simple first, and you can learn past perfect later if you want. This is the 80-20th principle applied to grammar. Focus on the 20% of grammar that accounts for 80% of communication.
That's really practical. So learners should focus on these 6 categories and the high-frequency structures within each.
Yes, and here is the good news. If you focus on these, you can reach a functional level of English relatively quickly. Then, if you want to improve your accuracy or learn more advanced structures, could do that. But you don't need to for basic communication.
James, I want to talk about the difference between grammar for understanding and grammar for production. Are they the same?
Great question. They're related, but they're not exactly the same. Grammar for understanding is when you are reading or listening to English. You need to understand grammar structures to comprehend what you are reading or hearing. For example, if you hear, I have been studying English for 5 years, you need to understand the present perfect continuous to know that the person started studying in the past and is still studying now. Grammar for production is when you are speaking or writing English. You need to produce correct grammar structures to communicate clearly. For example, if you want to say that you started studying in the past and are still studying now, you need to produce the present perfect continuous. Now, here's the important part. You need less grammar knowledge for understanding than for production. This is because, when you are reading or listening, you can use context to figure out meaning even if you don't understand every grammar structure perfectly. But when you are producing language, you need to be more accurate because you are responsible for clarity.
So you need more grammar knowledge for production than for understanding.
Yes, and this is why many learners can understand English better than they can speak it. They've gotten a lot of input, so they understand many grammar structures passively. But they haven't practiced producing these structures, so they can't use them when speaking. This is why speaking practice is so important. It forces you to produce grammar structures, which helps you learn them more deeply.
So speaking practice is essential for learning grammar for production.
Yes, and this is why I always recommend that learners balance input and output. Get lots of input through reading and listening, but also practice output through speaking and writing. This way, you learn grammar both for understanding and for production.
James, let's talk about specific grammar mistakes. Are there grammar mistakes that learners worry about but don't actually matter?
Oh yes, many. Let me go through some of the most common ones. Mistake number 1, ending sentences with prepositions. Many learners worry about this. They think you can't end a sentence with a preposition. But native speakers do this all the time. What are you talking about? Is perfectly natural. I don't know who she's talking to is perfectly natural. So learners don't need to worry about this. It's a myth that you can't end sentences with prepositions.
So that's not actually a mistake.
Exactly. It's a rule that even native speakers break constantly. Mistake number 2. Using they as a singular pronoun. Traditionally, you are supposed to use he or she for singular, but increasingly, native speakers use they as a singular pronoun. If someone calls, tell them I am busy. This is now widely accepted. So learners don't need to worry about this. It's becoming standard.
So that's also not a real mistake anymore.
Right. Language is evolving, and this is now acceptable. Mistake number 3. Splitting infinitives. Many learners worry about this. To boldly go is considered splitting an infinitive. But native speakers do this all the time, and it's now widely accepted. Mistake number 4. Using who instead of whom. Traditionally, whom is the object form, and who is the subject form. But in modern English, most native speakers just use who for both. Who are you talking to is now standard, even though technically it should be whom. So learners don't need to worry about this. Native speakers don't use whom much anymore.
So there are several rules that learners worry about, but don't actually matter.
Yes, and the reason is that language is constantly evolving. Rules that were strict 50 years ago are now relaxed, and learners should understand this. They don't need to follow rigid rules. They need to communicate naturally.
So what grammar mistakes do matter?
Grammar mistakes that affect comprehensibility matter. For example, wrong word order, I store go, instead of I go to the store. Wrong verb form, I go yesterday, instead of I went yesterday. Missing key words, I store, instead of I go to the store. Wrong preposition, I go in the store, instead of I go to the store. Depending on context, these mistakes affect understanding. So learners should focus on avoiding these. But minor mistakes like ending sentences with prepositions or using they as a singular pronoun don't matter much.
So the key is to focus on mistakes that affect comprehensibility.
Exactly. And most learners have this backwards. They obsess over minor mistakes and ignore major mistakes, but they should focus on the mistakes that actually affect communication.
James, so if learners should focus on certain grammar rules, how should they learn them?
Great question. So there are a few principles for learning grammar effectively. First, learn grammar in context. Don't learn grammar rules in isolation. Learn them in sentences and conversations. This way, you understand how the grammar is actually used in real communication. For example, instead of learning the present perfect is used for actions that started in the past and continue to the present, learn it by reading sentences like, I have lived in New York for 5 years. You understand the rule through the example. Second, learn grammar through comprehensible input. Read and listen to English at your level. Your brain will naturally pick up grammar patterns. You don't need to study every rule explicitly. Many rules will be learned implicitly through exposure. Third, practice producing the grammar. Once you've learned a grammar rule, practice using it in speaking and writing. This helps you internalize it and be able to use it automatically. Fourth, focus on high-frequency structures first. Don't try to learn all grammar at once. Focus on the most common structures first. Once you've mastered those, move on to less common structures. Fifth, don't obsess over perfection. Make mistakes. It's part of learning. As long as people understand you, you are doing fine.
So the key is to learn grammar in context through input with practice, focusing on high-frequency structures and not obsessing over perfection.
Yes, and this is a much more effective approach than traditional grammar study, which often focuses on rules in isolation, without context, without practice, and with an emphasis on perfection.
James, do you have any real examples of learners who've improved their English by changing their approach to grammar?
Oh yes, I had a student named Kenji from Japan. He had studied grammar for years. He knew all the rules, but he couldn't speak fluently because he was so focused on being correct. We changed his approach. We told him to stop worrying about grammar perfection and focus on communication. We had him do lots of speaking practice, even though he made mistakes. After 3 months, his fluency improved dramatically. He was making fewer mistakes because he was practicing, but more importantly, he was speaking naturally and confidently. He realized that grammar perfection wasn't as important as he thought.
That's a great example. Do you have another one?
I do. I had a student named Sofia from Brazil. She was obsessed with learning every grammar rule. She spent hours studying rare tenses like the past perfect continuous. But she didn't know basic vocabulary. We told her to stop studying rare grammar and focus on vocabulary instead. We had her read and listen to lots of English. After a few months, her English improved dramatically. She realized that vocabulary was more important than grammar. And ironically, she learned more grammar through reading and listening than she had through explicit study.
These are great examples. It really shows that the traditional approach to grammar isn't always the best.
Exactly. And the key insight is that grammar is a tool for communication, not the foundation of language learning. When learners understand this, they can approach grammar more strategically and learn more effectively.
James, so for our listeners who want to improve their grammar more effectively, what's one thing they can do this week?
I'd say identify the 6 essential grammar categories I mentioned: basic verb tenses, basic sentence structure, basic pronouns and articles, basic prepositions, basic question formation, and basic negation. If you haven't mastered these, focus on them. Don't worry about advanced grammar yet. Just focus on these 6 categories and learn them in context. Read sentences and conversations that use these structures. Don't study grammar rules in isolation.
That's simple and actionable. What about for people who already know the basics but want to improve their accuracy?
For those people, I'd recommend focusing on high-frequency mistakes. What mistakes do you make most often? Maybe you always use the wrong tense, or you always forget articles, or you always use the wrong preposition. Identify your most common mistakes and focus on those. Don't try to fix everything at once. Just focus on 1 or 2 mistakes. This is much more effective than trying to improve everything.
That's great advice. Any final thoughts?
Just remember, grammar is a tool, not the foundation. Focus on communication first, grammar second. Get lots of input, practice output, and don't obsess over perfection. With this approach, you'll improve much faster than with traditional grammar study.
James, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. This is incredibly valuable information.
Thanks for having me, Peter. I hope this helps our listeners approach grammar more strategically and learn more effectively.
For our listeners, if you want to connect with James or learn more about his approach to grammar, we'll have all his information in the show notes. And if you found this episode helpful, please share it with someone who's struggling with grammar. Thanks for listening to the English Podcast Daily with Peter. I am Peter, and I'll see you in the next episode.